Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at account questions in particular and looking at how Hitler strengthened Germany, the occupation of the Rhineland and also Anschluss. So remember, when you're asked an account question, we're thinking about the causes of change or the causes of the event that's asked in the question, what the outcomes are of that, so what happened as a result of the event that you're describing, and any key turning points if you are aiming for a grade 7 to 9. So let's have a look at one of these to have a go at an example. So we've got this one here. Write an account of how Hitler strengthened Germany 1933 to 1935. So remember, we're being asked to find the cause of how he strengthened Germany and also what the outcomes or key turning points of that change are. So first of all, a cause of him strengthening Germany was that, or being able to strengthen Germany, is that he was not stopped because he appeared peaceful and reasonable. So the reason he's able to, or the cause of him being able to strengthen Germany is it's difficult for the League of Nations to object to what he's doing. For example, the Saar plebiscite was a vote. The Saar had been an area of land where there's lots of coal and industry that used to belong to Germany, and it had been taken away as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations was supposed to be looking after it for 15 years or so. And it gets to the end of that period of time, and the League of Nations asks the Saar, or people from the Saar, to vote on what should happen, and 90% of them voted that they wanted to rejoin Germany. And this causes it to be possible for Hitler to strengthen Germany because it made it appear very reasonable that he wanted to unite all German-speaking people and that those people wanted to be united within Germany as well. Hitler also had control now. As a result of this, an outcome of that change is that Hitler has control of an area that's rich in coal, which he could use in factories for making weapons. And that would help him later on with things like Anschluss in 1938. Another reason that it's possible, another cause of Hitler being able to strengthen Germany, is lack of action by peacekeeping organisations. So the League of Nations was unable to effectively sanction Hitler for leaving the League of Nations Disarmament Conference in 1933 because they didn't have an army and the USA was no longer a key member. Well, actually, they were never a key member. So there were no real economic sanctions that would really work because Germany would always be able to still trade with the USA, which is a key trading partner. So because the League of Nations was unable to effectively sanction Hitler, that meant that Hitler knew that he could start to break terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations would be able to do very little to stop him. So we've also got in 1935 the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, another example of a lack of action by peacekeeping organisations to stop Hitler from strengthening Germany. Britain actually agreed to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935. They said that so long as the Navy's boats were only ever 35% the number that Britain had, and that Germany only ever had 45% the number of submarines that Britain had, then they could start to rebuild up their navy. And that led to Britain appearing to accept that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh or too unfair. And this enabled Germany to get stronger, and that meant that they could defend against other threats that they might face. The Stresa Front as well in 1935, signed by Britain, France and Italy, agreed to protect Austria's independence, but then actually it took very little action. So the Stresa Front being signed, great, it sounds like they're going to take action to prevent Hitler from breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but actually they didn't sanction any existing terms broken of the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler could continue doing things like making weapons and using coal and stocking it up, stockpiling coal and steel and things like that. There's nothing to stop him from doing that. And if the League of Nations and other peacekeeping organisations had actually taken action, then they probably could have stopped Hitler from strengthening Germany at this point. And I think that's why it's such a key turning point. In 1934, for example, Dollfuss affair, where the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss had been murdered by the Nazis, was an attempt by Hitler to take over Austria and cause Anschluss. And it was actually stopped by the Italian leader Mussolini, who prevented Germany invading the rest of Austria by putting his Italian troops on the border of Austria. And that was enough at the time of a threat to stop Hitler, because he knew his military wasn't actually strong enough. Germany's military was nowhere near strong enough at this point to invade and win over another army in order to take over Austria. So that is proof. The Dollfuss affair is proof that had other peacekeeping organisations actually stepped in and forced Hitler into accepting the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, they probably could have made him do that. So the fact that Britain accepted that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair and signed things like the German Naval Agreement in 1935 is a really key turning point, because it shows that they were willing to accept him breaking those terms of the treaty, and they allowed him to get stronger. So in terms of our account of how he strengthened Germany, we're saying one reason is that Hitler made his actions appear reasonable, so it was difficult for people to say no. And a second reason is that peacekeeping organisations didn't do enough to prevent Hitler from breaking the terms of peace treaties. Let's have a look at a second example. So this one here is write an account of the reoccupation of the Rhineland. Okay, so again we're looking for the causes of the reoccupation of the Rhineland being possible and what the outcomes of that are. So a first cause of the reoccupation of the Rhineland being possible is Hitler's election promises. So Hitler promised when he was elected in 1933 Lebensraum, which means living space, and to destroy the Diktat, which was the name that they gave to the Treaty of Versailles. This is an underlying cause of the reoccupation of the Rhineland. This is the kind of reason why, the background reason why they wanted to actually invade there. And another trigger reason, and the thing that really gave them the opportunity and caused as a trigger the reoccupation, was that France in 1935 signed the Franco-Soviet Pact with Russia. And the Franco-Soviet Pact, this sort of friendship between these two places, well, France is on the left of Germany and Russia is on the right of Germany. So Hitler argued that Germany was now under threat from a two-pronged attack, and that he needed to be able to protect himself. And the Rhineland, that area just to the left of Germany, had been demilitarised to protect France. Well, now France is making these threatening alliances with Russia. So that made it appear, and it led to it appearing quite reasonable for Hitler to want to remilitarise an area of his own country. So on the 7th of March 1936, troops were sent into the Rhineland. They didn't have any air support. Some of them were actually on bicycles. Ordinary Germans there greeted them with flowers. If France had retaliated and put troops on the ground to try and force Germany's army back out of the Rhineland, Germany wouldn't have been able to stand their ground. They wouldn't have been able to defend themselves. So actually, that lack of action, which kind of brings us on to the next point, is one of the reasons that they're able to successfully take over the Rhineland. So lack of action from the League of Nations is a real catalyst. It creates an environment where it's possible for the reoccupation of the Rhineland to be successful, as we've just sort of mentioned. So Britain had just recently signed a non-aggression Locarno Pact in 1936, and they had renewed alliances with France and Belgium, but they didn't prevent or push Germany out of the Rhineland. And France had just had a general election at the time, literally just recently, and they were worried that any politician that tried to start a war with Germany to get the troops out of the Rhineland next door would lose loads and loads of votes, because the idea of starting a war is expensive, it's going to cost in lives as well as in money. No one really wanted it. So France didn't take any action either. Spain was also not going to take any action either, because they were a new ally for Germany. Hitler had very cleverly recently built up alliances with Spain by giving them the Luftwaffe, which is their air force, during the Spanish Civil War, and sent troops and money and extra things like that to support Franco, who was the new head of Spain during the Civil War. So Spain wasn't going to take any action against their new ally. And then we've also got Japan, who'd recently signed the anti-Comintern Pact with Germany as well in 1936. Both Japan and Germany didn't like communism, so they both hated the USSR, so they'd kind of signed this agreement together in mutual hatred of the USSR. And that meant that none of these countries actually took action. None of them were going to prevent Germany from reoccupying the Rhineland. And it was this is a really key turning point. Those alliances that Hitler's built up and the other countries being too busy dealing with other things meant that the lack of action after openly breaking the Treaty of Versailles led Hitler to be more confident to break other terms. So the kind of long-term impact of the reoccupation of the Rhineland is that it gives Hitler the confidence to do things like Anschluss and the invasion of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and ultimately Poland, and the beginning of World War II. So let's have a look at a third and final example here. So we have another example of an account question, and this one is to write an account of Anschluss. So remember, if we're writing an account, we're looking at the causes of the event Anschluss and the outcomes and key turning points. So a cause of Anschluss, we've got fear of the Nazis is a really key cause of Anschluss. Remember, Anschluss means the joining together of Austria and Germany. So in 1934, in the Dollfuss affair, Dollfuss had been the old chancellor, which is like a prime minister or leader of Austria, and he had been murdered by some Nazis. And the new chancellor, Schuschnigg, was being bribed and terrorised by the Nazis, and he was fearing for his life. He feared he would also be murdered by the Nazis unless he did what they said. And this causes Anschluss because Schuschnigg, the new chancellor that we've just mentioned, who's being bribed and terrorised by Nazis, is forced into appointing a Nazi, giving him a job as the head of the Austrian police. So Seyss-Inquart is the name of this Nazi, and he is put in charge of the Austrian police force. And this is a really key turning point. Remember, you have to mention the key turning point to get a 7 to 9, because Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi, as the head of the police force, could prevent any opposition to Germany's invasion from the Austrian police. So when the Germans and all their sort of men arrive into Austria, there's no retaliation from the German police, from the Austrian police or the Austrian army, because Seyss-Inquart has told them not to prevent it. And that makes the invasion appear really peaceful and reasonable. The German troops appear to just wander in. And another reason why why Anschluss is possible is that, again, Hitler makes it appear reasonable because he makes sure that a plebiscite or a vote is held, which makes it appear like it's something that is wanted. Now, Schuschnigg, the chancellor that we've mentioned of Austria, had tried to hold the vote or the plebiscite before Hitler arrived in the hope that that would show that not all Austrians actually wanted him in charge of their country. But Hitler had threatened him, so the vote was delayed until after Hitler arrived, and in fact Schuschnigg was forced to resign from his position, which means to quit his job, and Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi, replaced him as the Chancellor of Austria. So we now have a Nazi as the Chancellor of Austria. and the vote is held after the Nazis have all wandered into Austria, and so there are stormtroopers or kind of Nazi army people standing by voters when they vote. So unsurprisingly, in March 1938, the plebiscite or the vote resulted in a 99% yes vote to Anschluss, to Germany and Austria joining together as one country. So ultimately, the lack of action from the League of Nations and the Streseefront, that recent agreement that we've mentioned just now between Britain and France and Italy, that it would prevent this Anschluss from happening, the lack of action from the Streseefront and the League of Nations, despite prior agreement to protect Austrian independence, meant that it was really easy for the Nazis to take over. And again, this is a key turning point because Nazi invasion of Austria could easily have been stopped. Many tanks actually ran out of petrol on their way and had to go to petrol stations, believe it or not. And lots of them also got lost and had to go and try and buy maps of Austria to try and find their way to where they needed to be. So it was really disorganised invasion. They could easily have been stopped if any of these groups had actually stepped in. But because they didn't, and because Hitler had organised this plebiscite to make it look very reasonable, it was easy for them to take over. So Anschluss was possible. Now, it's true that some people in Austria did actually want Hitler to be in charge, because they had really struggled as a result of the Great Depression, and also they'd been really badly damaged by a peace treaty at the end of World War One as well. So they hadn't been under the Treaty of Versailles, but they'd been under the Treaty of Saint-Germain. And so they were hoping that maybe Hitler would make them great again as a nation, which is what he was promising to the German people. So Anschluss was possible because a fear of the Nazis meant that they were able to control the new Austrian Chancellor, and because Hitler was clever about making it appear that what he was doing reasonable by using plebiscites or votes. So don't forget, if you're asked to write an account question, you're looking at the causes of that event and what the key outcomes are and any key turning points. To try and mention those for the 7 to 9. Best of luck with your revision.